As the elderly veteran eased into the plush first-class seat, a mix of emotions played across his weathered face. He shifted slightly, adjusting the armrest, his hands trembling faintly, not just from age, but from the overwhelming kindness he had just experienced. A flight attendant approached him, offering a complimentary drink and a warm blanket. "The young man said you should have this seat," she explained gently. The veteran gave a small, almost disbelieving smile. "It's been years since I've been treated like this," he murmured, his voice carrying the weight of a lifetime of sacrifice. He turned his head, glancing toward the back of the plane. There, Barron Trump sat quietly, his attention already back on the hardcover book in his hands, seemingly unfazed by the whispers around him. He had made his choice and moved on, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. For a brief moment, the tension that had hung in the cabin during boarding seemed to dissipate. Passengers settled into their seats, the soft chime of the seatbelt sign signaling the start of the journey. As the plane taxied onto the runway, engines roaring to life, many still exchanged knowing glances. This flight, what had begun as a simple trip from Washington, D.C. to Newark, was already proving to be anything but ordinary. Yet, the most remarkable part of the story was still to come. As the plane ascended, reaching cruising altitude, the atmosphere inside remained charged. Flight attendants moved smoothly through the aisles, offering drinks and snacks, but there was an undeniable energy lingering in the air. People kept glancing between first class and economy, between the elderly veteran now reclining in unexpected comfort and the young man who had so easily given up his privilege. What had begun as whispers of admiration slowly grew into quiet conversations. The act of kindness had not just been noticed. It had left a lasting impression. The veteran sat quietly at first, sipping his water and gazing out the window. His fingers absent-mindedly traced the edges of a small pin on his lapel, a purple heart. The movement was subtle, but those seated near him noticed the faint tremor in his hands. Then, as if the weight of the moment had become too much to keep to himself, he turned to the woman seated beside him, a middle-aged traveler with kind eyes. "I have to say something," he murmured, just loud enough for her to hear. She looked at him, curiosity flickering in her expression. He adjusted the pin on his jacket, taking a slow breath. "That young man, his family saved my life once." The woman's eyebrows lifted in surprise. "What do you mean?" The veteran leaned back slightly, his voice growing steadier as he began to share a story buried deep in his past. "It was decades ago, during the Vietnam War. I was stationed overseas, far from home, no family support. I was badly wounded, shot twice in the leg. When I finally made it back to the States, I was lost. No direction, no purpose." His voice wavered, but he pushed on. "I ended up in New York, just trying to rebuild my life. Didn't have a place to stay, barely enough money for food. One day, I ran into a man outside a diner. He saw me struggling, didn't just hand me $1 and walk away. He sat with me, listened to my story. That man was Fred Trump." The woman gasped softly, and nearby passengers who had been subtly eavesdropping leaned in closer. "Fred Trump?" she repeated. The veteran nodded, his expression turning wistful. "He didn't owe me a thing, but he made sure I had a roof over my head, helped me get back on my feet, never asked for anything in return. Just told me, 'You served this country. It's the least we can do.'" I never forgot those words. A hush fell over the passengers within earshot. The murmurs that had started earlier began to ripple once more, spreading the story from one row to the next. The veteran's voice grew stronger. "I always wanted to thank his family, but life moved on, and I thought I'd lost that chance forever. And now, today, that man's grandson, he's given me a gift. I'll never forget." He exhaled deeply, shaking his head as if he himself couldn't quite believe it. What are the odds? In economy, Barron Trump remained unaware of the quiet revelation happening just a few rows ahead. He turned another page in his book, oblivious to the emotional stir his simple decision had caused. But in first class, the weight of the veteran's words settled over the passengers like an invisible force. One by one, they exchanged glances, absorbing the deeper meaning of what had just unfolded. A man across the aisle, in his early 40s with a tired but approachable face, finally broke the silence. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "But your story really hit home. My grandfather served in Vietnam too. He used to talk about how much it meant when people back home cared enough to help. Hearing what Fred Trump did for you, well, that's rare. Too rare." The veteran nodded, his lips curling into a faint smile. "It's the little things, son. People don't realize how far a small act of kindness can go. Back then, I thought my life was over. But that man's generosity gave me a second chance." Across the aisle, a young mother cradling a sleeping toddler spoke up, her voice thoughtful. "You know, my dad always told me the same thing. He wasn't a veteran, but he believed that when someone lifts you up, even just a little, you pass it on. It's like a chain reaction." More heads turned, more voices murmured in agreement. What had started as a simple seat swap had now transformed into something far greater. A reminder that kindness, no matter how small, has the power to ripple through time, connecting people in ways they never imagined. And as the flight continued its journey toward Newark, it was clear that every person on board had just become part of a story they would never forget. The murmurs continued to ripple through the cabin as more passengers leaned in, absorbing the weight of the veteran's revelation. What had started as a quiet flight had now turned into something deeply personal for everyone who had heard his story. The man across the aisle, who had just shared how his grandfather had served in Vietnam, nodded thoughtfully. "It really makes you think," he said, his voice low. "How many lives have been changed by small, unseen acts of kindness? How many people carry stories like yours without ever getting a chance to share them?" The veteran exhaled slowly, glancing down at his hands. "More than we'll ever know," he said, his voice tinged with emotion. "People see the headlines, the big moments that make history, but they forget that history is shaped by everyday people, by the little things, the quiet choices that seem small at the time but ripple through generations." Across the cabin, a few passengers nodded in agreement. The woman seated next to the veteran, who had been listening intently, smiled softly. "And today, history is still being written," she said, "right here on this plane." The words lingered in the air for a moment. Then, as if on cue, another voice joined the conversation. "I wasn't in the military," said a middle-aged businessman seated 2 rows ahead. "But my father always told me that real character isn't about what you do when people are watching. It's about what you do when no one is." He glanced back toward economy, where Barron sat, still immersed in his book. "That kid, he had no idea anyone would talk about this. He didn't do it for attention." The veteran nodded. "That's what makes it mean even more." At that moment, a flight attendant approached the veteran once again, lowering her voice. "Would you like me to tell him?" she asked, motioning toward Barron. The elderly man hesitated. He looked back toward the young man who was still seated in economy, unaware of the conversation happening just a few rows away. After a moment, he shook his head. "Not yet," he said softly. "Let the boy have his peace. He doesn't need to know how much this means to me. Not right now." The flight attendant nodded in understanding and stepped away. But even though Barron remained oblivious, the impact of his action had already spread far beyond that single gesture. The plane was still soaring through the sky, but in that moment, it wasn't just moving through the air. It was carrying something deeper, a reminder of the power of kindness, of gratitude, of how the past and present could intertwine in ways no one could predict. And then something even more unexpected happened. A woman a few rows ahead, who had been quietly observing the conversation, turned toward the veteran with a soft smile. "Sir, I know this might be a bit forward," she began, "but I run a nonprofit that helps veterans share their stories. We work to make sure these experiences aren't forgotten." The veteran blinked, caught off guard. She continued, her voice warm but sincere. "Would you ever consider sharing your story, not just with us, but with the younger generation? Because I think more people need to hear what you just told us." For a moment he was silent. Then, slowly, he nodded. "I think I'd like that." The atmosphere on the plane had shifted entirely. What had started as a routine flight had turned into something unforgettable. And as the aircraft began its descent into Newark, it was clear that everyone on board would be leaving with more than just their luggage. They would be carrying a story, a memory, a reminder that even the smallest gestures can leave a lasting mark. And for those who had witnessed it firsthand, it was proof that kindness, true selfless kindness, could still surprise the world. As the plane taxied toward the gate, the hum of the engines gradually began to fade. The cabin, once filled with the usual noise of chatter and the rustling of luggage, seemed to fall into a quiet, collective stillness. Passengers who had just moments before been preoccupied with the mundane tasks of flying, flipping through magazines, adjusting their seatbacks, or scrolling through their phones, now felt something different in the air. The weight of the moment had settled over them, an unspoken understanding lingering between them all. What had started as just another routine flight had somehow transformed into something far greater, a reminder of the simple yet profound impact that small acts of kindness can have. Barron Trump, who had been sitting in the quiet comfort of first class, had watched the entire scene unfold without much outward expression. He sat by the window, his posture still and his demeanor reserved. To an observer, he may have seemed unchanged, his face as unreadable as ever, his attention fixed on the pages of his book. But, deep down, something had shifted in him, though he couldn't quite name it. The words of the elderly veteran, the heartfelt revelation about his grandfather, the way the entire plane had been moved by his simple, selfless gesture. It all hung in the air like an invisible thread, pulling everyone together in a way none of them had anticipated. As the plane reached the gate and passengers began to gather their belongings, Barron noticed the glances being cast in his direction. A few passengers paused as they passed, murmuring quiet words of appreciation. There was no grand display, no applause, just a gentle acknowledgement of the ripple effect his small act of kindness had set in motion. Some passengers merely nodded in his direction, the weight of their silent gratitude filling the space between them. The veteran, who had spent the duration of the flight in first class, looked over at Barron one last time before standing up. As Barron stood to retrieve his bag, the veteran, who had previously been sitting beside him, tipped his hat toward him in a final gesture of respect. "You've got a good heart, son," the veteran said, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "Don't ever lose that." Barron's usual reserved demeanor softened just enough to reveal the impact of those words. A small nod was all he offered in return, but it was enough. Something inside him stirred, something that was both new and familiar. As he slung his bag over his shoulder and made his way toward the exit, the noise of the bustling airport seemed distant, as though his mind was still on the moments he had just experienced. Pulling out his phone, Barron hesitated for a moment, his fingers hovering over the screen. Slowly, he typed a brief message. Grandpa would have been proud of today. With a deep breath, he hit send, the weight of the words settling within him. It wasn't just a simple message, it was a moment of connection with his past, a way of honoring the legacy of kindness his grandfather had left behind. It was a reminder that the smallest of actions could sometimes mean more than the grandest of gestures. As Barron walked toward the baggage claim, the hum of the airport gradually brought him back to reality. But the events of the flight lingered, settling in the corners of his mind, slowly taking root. What had started as a simple, selfless act had rippled through the cabin, touching everyone in its path. Passengers continued their journey, but they carried with them more than just their luggage. They carried a reminder that kindness still mattered, that small gestures could still change lives, even if they weren't always recognized. The veteran's story, shared among strangers, had touched something deep within them all. The legacy of Fred Trump, who had given without expecting anything in return, had come full circle. And as the passengers disembarked, many paused to thank Barron, offering handshakes and words of gratitude. They had been witnesses to something extraordinary, a moment in time that proved the power of empathy and human connection. The veteran, now preparing to leave the plane, gave Barron one final look before turning to exit. With a tip of his hat and a quiet smile, he left the young man with one last piece of wisdom. "Don't ever lose that good heart, son." It was a small comment, but it held so much meaning, both for Barron and for everyone who had been part of this shared experience. If you believe in the power of kindness, share this video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more inspiring stories. Together, we can remind the world that compassion still exists, and it starts with us.